The WNBA thought it could keep secrets under wraps. They thought they could find Sophie Cunningham into silence, slap her on the wrist, and move on like nothing happened. But what they didn't count on was Sophie refusing to play by their rules, and now the league is facing a firestorm, a backlash it cannot control. This is and just another case of a player running her mouth. If you're here for the real story and not to filter version, subscribe. And if you're sticking around for the next meltdown, you better definitely subscribe. There's a Sophie Cunningham, a veteran presence and rising cultural voice. User platform shine a spotlight on the one thing the league doesn't want to talk about: it obsession with controlling the narrative through her podcast Show Me Something. Sophie didn't just criticize officiating, she called out the system itself. She pulled back the curtain and told fans exactly what was happening behind the scenes, and for that the WNBA dropped the hammer, finds threats, and now reportedly her release in the Indiana Fever. Let's pause there for a second, because think about how crazy this is. Sophie Cunningham, a role player who carved her way into relevancy, not to flashy stats, but to personality, grit, and her refusal to fake it has suddenly become the league's most dangerous figure now, because she's dominating on the court, but because she's speaking the truth off it. And the truth, it hurts. On our podcast, Sophie laid it all out: the fines for criticizing officials that come not just after games, but even after podcast or offhand remarks; the selective enforcement, where some stars get away with commentary while others are slapped with penalties; the way to leave quietly pushes players till the company line, discouraging any honesty that might make the brand look messy. And when Sophie broke that silence, when she told of and exactly how suffocating it feels to be punished for simply telling the truth, the WNBA response was reform. It wasn't reflection, it was retaliation. That's what a word fire comes in, because let's be real, when you cover my team right after exposing the league's dirty laundry, don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to see what's happening. Sophie wasn't just another roster casualty, she was made into an example, a warning to the rest of the league. Don't talk out of turn or you'll be next. But here's where the WNBA made a colossal mistake. They underestimated the fans, because fans aren't buying PR spin. They're not swallowing the team fit excuses or the just basketball narrative. They see exactly what's happening, and their furious social media is rallying around Sophie. Colleague or the league's truth teller fans are flooding our podcast support, boosting her platform far beyond what would have been if the league had just ignored her and tried to silence her. The WNBA has accidentally made her voice louder than ever, and isn't that poetic? The league tried to bury her, and instead they turned her into a martyr. Now, let's dig into what Sophie actually said, because that's the core of this whole storm. She wasn't complaining about calls that didn't go her way. She was pointing out systemic problems, the inconsistency in officiating, where some players, usually the league's golden children, get star treatment, while others yet whistled into oblivion. The disproportionate fines where criticism from one player earns a slap on the wrist, but from another earns a paycheck-draining penalty. The sense of the league is more interested in controlling image than fixing problems. And you know what? She's not wrong. Fancy it players whisper about it, media members dance around it. Sophie just had the guts to say it outright, and in saying it, she struck a chord not just with Fever fans, not just a casual WNBA watchers, but with anyone who's ever been frustrated by lead-up PR above reality. That's why there's controversy is bigger than basketball. All this is about free speech. This is about authenticity. This is about whether players are allowed to be themselves, or whether they're required to be polished, sanitized brand ambassadors for a league that hasn't figured out how to embrace authenticity. Because here's the irony: Sophie's podcast, Show Me Something, was a kind of authentic player, drew content to lead to been celebrating. It was wrong, it was real. It gave fans behind the scenes look at the WNBA in a way that the league's corporate channels never could. It drew eyeballs, created engagement, and generated exactly the kind of buzz WNBA acclaimed that wants, but instead of harnessing the energy, they tried to crush it. Why? Because Sophie didn't play nice shooting, protect the shield. She told the truth, and that's what scares them now. Think about the message to send other players. If Sophie Cunningham can define into oblivion and cut loose just for being honest, what does that mean for everyone else? It creates a culture of fear, a culture where players by their tongues swallow their frustrations and parrot save lines instead of speaking their minds. And when that happens, the league doesn't just lose control, it loses authenticity. It loses exacting that makes sports worth watching. Real people showing real emotion. Fans don't want robots. They don't want scripted sound bites. They want fire. They want honesty. They want Sophie Cunningham saying quiet part out loud. And now that the WNBA is made of the poster child for silence voices, they've handed fans a rallying cry hashtag. Free Sophie. Imagine how powerful that could get. Every find she gets turns into content. Every attempt to silence or turns into another viral moment. Every player who secretly agrees with her, but it's too afraid to speak. They're watching, they're waiting, and one by one the league's attempt to control crumble. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Sophie isn't backing down. She's not folding under pressure. She's doubling down, using her podcast amplifier voice, run wave of fan support, and leaning into role of truth teller, whether the league likes it or not. And in doing so, she's become more powerful than she ever was as a role player on the Fever. Because let's be honest, Sophie Cunningham's dads were never going to make her a household name, but Sophie Cutting, the rebel Sophie Cunningham, the whistleblower Sophie Cunningham, the woman who refused to let the WNBA muzzle her, that's a story, that movement, that's something that resonates far beyond the box score, and the league knows it. That's why they're panicking. That's why they're hitting her with fines, why they're sending a message that dissent won't be tolerated. But the problem is they've already lost control of the narrative. As a fan, Sophie as the microphone, Sophie as the authenticity that the league can't manufacture. So what happens next? That's the million-dollar question. Does a WNBA double down, continue, fine, and blacklist her, hoping to storm eventually dies out? Or do they realize it and try to silence Sophie? They've created a monster they can contain. Do they finally acknowledge the issue she's raising, embrace player authenticity, and try to fix the cracks exposed? Because if they don't, this won't just be Sophie Cunningham's fight. This could spiral into a league-wide rebellion. More players might start speaking out. More fans might start demanding transparency. And WNBA, a league that desperately wants to grow its brand, expands audience, can find it so collapsing under the weight with own obsession with control. And let's not forget the poetic irony here. Sophie's podcast is called Show Me Something. Well, she just showed the world something the WNBA didn't want us to see. And the league's attempt to punish or has only made people want to watch and listen even more. So is Sophie Cunningham the villain? The WNBA want to be what a hero fans have been waiting for? That's up for debate. But one thing is clear, this fight isn't going away. It's only getting louder. Will you think, should leagues have the right to muzzle players in the name of protecting their brand? Or do players like Sophie have a responsibility to tell the truth no matter the cost? And will the WNBA realize it create a PR nightmare, or they keep digging their own grave? Whatever happens, one thing's certain: Sophie Cunningham just changed the game and will be here for every twist, every fine, and every explosion along the way. All right, let's keep going, because of Sophie Cunningham's saga isn't just some petty clash over fines. No, this has become something much bigger. What we're watching unfold as a WNBA attempt to hold on to control in the oldest, ugliest way possible. Punish the voice that refuses a fall in line. And Sophie, she's a voice they couldn't tame. Here's the thing the league has always been careful about: its image is a growing brand still fighting for attention in a crowded sports world. That means to guard their narrative like it's gold. They don't want cracks in the paint. They don't want players saying things that might suggest league isn't as polished or perfect as the commercials make it look. But what happens when a player refuses to play the part, when she leans into the raw, the messy, the honest? That's Sophie Cunningham, and the WNBA has no idea how to deal with her, because Sophie feed into tiptoe around issues. She went straight at them. She said out loud were players whispering locker rooms officiating is inconsistent. Star players get favoritism, and the fines are ridiculous. She called like she saw it, and fans loved it. Finally, they said someone's telling the truth, someone's giving us the real story. The WNBA could have embraced that. They could have leaned into a podcast, Show Me Something, turn her into the league, then firebrand. Instead of muzzling her, they could have said, hey, this is part what makes our league exciting. Our players speak their minds. Imagine the PR when if they had just let Sophie be Sophie. Instead, they turned her into an enemy. And when you fire truth teller, you don't silence her, you make louder. Let's talk about the fans were second, because this is where the league made its biggest miscalculation. Fans love authenticity, they crave it. They're sick of cookie cutter quotes like "we did ever play harder" or credit to both teams. They want emotion, they were honesty. That's why players like Sophie resonate now, because you've dropping 40 in night, but because she's saying what everyone else is too scared to say. So in a WNBA keeps slapping her refines. Fans aren't thinking, oh, she went too far. They're thinking, why is the league so scared for words? Every fine makes her look braver. Every punishment makes the league look weaker, and fire in her that makes her a martyr. This is where it starts to feel like a movie. Sophie's sitting in front of Mike speaking to a podcast, undeterred by fines, smiling. As you know, the league can't stop people from listening. Every fan that hears or isn't just entertained, they're emboldened. They start tweeting, they start calling out the lead, they start asking uncomfortable questions. Why do some players, if while others don't? Why isn't the league addressing the issues Sophie talks about? Why are they punishing transparency instead of rewarding it? And once those questions start spreading, the WNBA loses control. Because the truth is, Sophie has exposed something leagues hate admitting: players are free their employees, and those employees are expected to say the right things, whether they believe them or not. That's the unwritten contract. Play hard, keep quiet, protect the brand. But Sophie ripped their contract and half live on air, and for that she's paying a price. But here's the twist: she's not the only one. Other players are watching. They may not say it out loud, but you better believe they're nodding along when Sophie calls out officiating inconsistencies. They felt too they've been whistled for fouls and commit. They've seen calls swallowed for star players. They bid their tongues and press conferences because they know what a fine costs. Sophie just had the guts to put it on record. And now the league's crackdown has creates something it can undo: fear and resentment. Fear because players now know if they speak up, they'll get crushed. Resentment because deep down they know Sophie wasn't wrong. That's a dangerous cocktail. It doesn't to silence players, it builds pressure. And when that pressure finally blows, the league will have a full-blown rebellion on his hands. Let's also talk about money, because that's where the story is the hardest. Sophie isn't a max contract superstar. Every fine hurts, every penalty digs into her livelihood, and yet she keeps talking. That right there is why fans call her the truth teller, because she's risking something real to give him honesty. She's sacrificing comfort to pull back the curtain, and that powerful. Meanwhile, the league is risking something to credibility by punishing Sophie. They're telling fans, we don't care about the truth. You'll get the story we want you to have. And in 2025, fans don't accept that. They got social media podcasts, independent media voices. They don't need the league's press releases. They want the real thing, unfiltered, and Sophie is giving it to them. The irony: her podcast is more popular than ever. The WNBA tried to bury her, and instead they build her platform. Every fine turns into an episode, every punishment turns into content, and fans tune in, not just to hear Sophie's takes, but a supporter and of the league. The WNBA accidentally created its own biggest critic and gave her all the ammunition she needs. Now let's imagine where this goes. The league has two options. They can keep doubling down, finding Sophie, blackballing her, hoping she fade into irrelevance, but that only fuels her fire. Or they can admit they mishandled this. They can embrace player voices, losing their grip on a narrative, and recognize that authenticity is what fans crave. But does the WNBA have the humility to do that? All pride dragged them deeper into this mess. If history tells us anything, leagues rarely admit for until it's too late. And that's a real tragedy here. Sophie Cunningham could have been an asset. She could have been a league's unfiltered star, the player fans loved here, even if they don't always agree. Instead, she's a phase of rebellion, and the WNBA made it that way. So what does Sophie go from here? Maybe she gets picked up by another team. Maybe she doesn't, but one thing for sure, her voice isn't going anywhere. If anything, it's louder than ever. She's not a Sophie Cunningham basketball player. She's Sophie Cunningham, truth teller, whistleblower, martyr, and that role it lasts longer than any season. Fans will forget this. Players will forget this, and the league won't be able to pretend it didn't happen. All right, let's crank this thing up. Because of Sophie Cunningham, drama is no longer does about a few fines or a podcast. No, this is about entirely caught red-handed, try to silence the one voice that refuses to bend, and in doing so they've sparked something they cannot control. Sophie's gone from being that scrappy fever play will Mike to the centerpiece or a billion in the WNBA is fumbling every step of the way. Think about how rare this is. Normally, when a player gets fined for talking too much, they apologize, maybe tone it down, and life moves on. But Sophie, she doubled down. Every fine, every warning, every threat from the lead and silence her fueled her. She took their punishment and flipped it into content, into storytelling, and to prove that she was hitting a nerve. And the fans at up her podcast, Show Me Something, was already gaining traction. But now, the full-on megaphone. Every episode feels like a middle finger to the league office, And every time the WNBA tries to muzzle her, her audience multiplies. They've turned her into something league never wanted, a cult hero. And that's the real danger here. Sophie Cunningham is no superstar on the stat sheet. She's not phase of the league like Caitlin Clark or the poster girl dominance like Io Wilson. But because she's willing to say what no one else will, she's become something even bigger, the voice of authenticity. That voice can be measured in points, rebounds is measured, and loyalty. Fans are riding Wood or not because he's dropping 30 a night, but because she's telling the truth when everyone else is too scared. Now, let's talk about the hypocrisy, because that's what really is fans boiling the WNBA. Love the parade around the idea that they empower their players, that they celebrate individuality and authenticity, but what happens? A second a player uses that individuality to question in the system, they get slapped with fines, they get threatened, they get fired. Fans aren't stupid. They see the double standard. If you're playing nice, if you're marketable and safe, you get celebrated. But if you're wrong, if you're critical of, you expose the cracks, suddenly you're a problem. And the officiating piece, that's where Sophie struck the biggest nerve. Everyone who watches the WNBA knows officiating has been a mess. The games swing wildly on inconsistent calls. Stars get away with murder while role players get hammered for the smallest contact, and referees rarely face accountability. Sophie didn't invent those critiques. She just had the guts to make them public. And instead of saying, you know what, maybe we should look into this, the law led decided to silence silencer that says everything was wild. Is how obvious this looks now. Sophie gets fined for saying rest favorite star players. But then fans watch a game where Caitlin Clark give McGuinn no whistle while our teammate gets hit for breathing too hard on defense. Sophie gets fined for pointing out inconsistencies, but fancy with their own eyes every single game. She's not making things up. She's validating what fans already feel, and the WNBA punishing her only make them angrier because it feels like to leave would rather gaslight them than fix the problem. That's where this gets dangerous for the WNBA. Fans aren't supporting Sophie. They're starting to distrust the league itself. They're questioning whether the WNBA actually cares about fairness, whether actually listens, or whether she's a machine obsessed with image control. That's a slippery slope, because once fans stop believing in Intalio product, you can't win. I'm back with a flashy commercial or slogan about empowerment. And then there's the locker room dynamic. Don't think for a second other players aren't paying attention. They may not be rushing to Sophie's defense publicly because they've seen what happens if you do, but you better believe they're not quietly in agreement. They've been fined till they felt muzzled, till they've seen teammates get punished for saying what everyone knows is true. Sophie Cunningham just happened to be the one brave or stubborn enough to stop caring about the consequences. Imagine what happens if more players start follow her lead. What of veterans Diana Taurasi or Candace Parker, who earned the right to say whatever they want, start echoing Sophie? That's what of younger stars emboldened by the fan support. Sophie's getting to decide. They're tired of being controlled. The lead wouldn't just have one role player. They have a full-on player uprising, and let's not forget the irony of timing. The WNBA is in the middle of its biggest growth spurt ever. Attendance is up, viewership is climbing, sponsors are finally buying, and in star powers an all-time high. They should be their golden era, but instead of riding a wave, they're shipping on a rake. Instead of letting a player like Sophie add momentum with Iraq honesty, they're making headlines for all the wrong reasons. Instead of celebrating transparency, they're punishing it. This isn't as bad optics, it's bad business, because here's the truth. Leagues don't survive by controlling narratives, they survive by creating stories people unfollow, and Sophie Cunningham's story fans want it. They're invested, they're tuning in, they're rallying, they're making her bigger than she ever was on the court. The WNBA doesn't realize it, but Sophia's just become one of the biggest stars, and they created or by try and destroy her. Now picture T.